G'day folks, Mad Aussie here and welcome to the Aussie Report. 2022 marks the 50th anniversary of Aboriginal 10 Embassy, and so I'm going to read a message out from Lil Gordon, who is Head of Aboriginal Affairs, and then we're going to take a look at a recent article. So Lil says, I would like to pay tribute that this year is the 50th year that the Aboriginal 10 Embassy in Canberra has existed and has been powerful focus of land rights, sovereignty and self-determination for Aboriginal people across Australia. 50 years ago, on Australia Day, a small group of Aboriginal protesters drove from Redfern to Ngunnawal country in Canberra. They were part of the Black Power movement in Sydney and were responding to the refusal of the federal government to recognise Aboriginal land rights. Michael Anderson, Billy Craigie, Bertie Williams and Tony Curry planted a beach umbrella in the lawn opposite Parliament House, which is now Old Parliament House, and erected a sign that said simply Aboriginal Embassy. This powerfully communicated that Aboriginal people had never ceded sovereignty nor engaged in any treaty process with the Crown. Rapidly gathering support, the embassy grew and was joined by Aboriginal people from across Australia. Police removed the embassy a number of times in 1972, but the embassy came back stronger with more and more people joining protests. The 10 Embassy played a vital part in gaining land rights. Gary Foley has called it the most effective political action in the history of the Aboriginal struggle. A small act of erecting a beach umbrella with a sign on a lawn in our nation's capital has become the longest protest for Aboriginal land rights in the world. On this January the 26th, I pay respect to all those who started the 10 Embassy and all those who have ensured the continuation of this strong commitment to our sovereign rights and self-determination. So that was Lil Gordon, who was Head of Aboriginal Affairs. So let's take a look at this article. This is on the Sydney Criminal Lawyers website, which is sydneycriminallawyers.com.au. It is titled, The Aboriginal 10 Embassy Doesn't Support the Voice Referendum. This was posted on the 2nd of May 2022 and written by Paul Gregoire. This goes on to say, Aboriginal 10 Embassy representatives are asserting that the Albanese government's prioritisation of the implementation of the Uluru Statement from the Heart is flawed, as no real on-the-ground consensus has ever been established with First Nation peoples in this regard. The main crux of the new government's initiative is to hold a referendum to establish a constitutionally enshrined Indigenous voice to Parliament, which would be a body of First Nation representatives charged with advising government on its approach to Aboriginal affairs. Released on the 26th of May 2017 at the National Constitutional Convention, the Uluru Statement sets out a path that aims to overcome the structural racism and injustices First Nations people have faced in this country, via a process of establishing the voice, followed by treaty making and then truth-telling. However, a strong contingent of prominent First Nation rights advocates has always maintained that recognising Indigenous peoples in the Australian Constitution could threaten unceded Indigenous sovereignty, and the capacity of any advisory body hardly signals self-determination. The 10 Embassy is seeking greater consultation on what the new Labor government is proposing, including on the putting of these questions to a national vote, which again doesn't represent an act of First Peoples determining their own future. The next section is titled A First Nations Parliament. It was a flawed process, said Aboriginal 10 Embassy Ambassador Gwenda Stanley, who was at the National Convention. It was a proposal that they pushed through without proper consultation and by shutting people down. It needs to be brought back to the people. The Gomeroi woman told Sydney Criminal Lawyers, "We don't belong in any constitution. It needs to come back to First Nation people in general instead of asking the rest of Australia. Over a 6-month period, starting in December 2016, 12 First Nation regional dialogues were held across the continent to discuss constitutional recognition, which was a campaign to see Indigenous peoples recognised within the founding document, of which they were omitted in 1901. This process culminated in the National Convention, which resulted in the more robust voice proposal first being flagged to wider Australia. However, those in disagreement walked out of the meeting, claiming that they were being shut down and asserting that treaty was the way forward. We want our own parliament and our own constitution. We don't belong in a European Australian constitution, Stanley continued. Let's have a truth commission. Let's start talking about reparations, and let's start talking about the genocide and how Australia was settled. Scrolling down, we have a photo there from the Tent Embassy, and the next section is titled One Voice at the Table. New South Wales Aboriginal Land Rights Association Chief Executive Clayton Simpson Pitt explains that a small group fronting the dialogues on recognition, which was led by the Cape York Institute's Noel Pearson, put the Voice to Parliament proposal to the other delegates as the only option. Simpson, Pitt and Stanley first met at the February 2017 dialogue that was held in Dubbo, and due to their contributions during the meeting, they were invited to the national conference. Both of them rejected the Uluru Statement and were part of the walkout. Noel wrote the proposal and was pushing for it from the get-go, and it was basically being pushed down our throats, recalled the Uluru Kamilaroi Wheelman man. No one there put the wording of the statement together. The Aboriginal people on the Referendum Council sat down and wrote it. A referendum puts the power in the hands of the rest of Australia. Our freedom is effectively being taken, the rights advocate added. We need a national vote with just Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to get consensus before we ever get to a referendum. And a picture here of New South Wales Aboriginal Land Rights Association Chief Executive Clayton Simpson Pitt. And next title is Hard Truths Must Be Told. New Indigenous Affairs Minister Lindy Barney is calling on the opposition to open its mind to the Voice proposition which it dismissed in government, and in terms of the Greens' deferring stance on it, the Wiradjuri woman said she's a little confused about what their position exactly is. The Greens consider that what proposed in the Uluru Statement is in the wrong order, as what's needed first is a truth-telling commission, which would then lead to an honesty treaty making process, and any talk of a voice to Parliament could be dealt with after that. The party wants to see a Truth and Justice Commission established. Green Senator Lydia Thorpe was amongst the delegates who walked out of the 2017 National Convention. The Gunai Gunditjmara and Djap Wurrung woman told the press at the time that treaty was the answer. According to Stanley, any truth-telling process must include the nation acknowledging the genocide perpetrated upon the First Peoples, which involved colonial massacres, their rounding up and being placed in controlled environments on reserves, as well as the taking of land by force. The British didn't come here for a penal colony, said Simpson Pitt on the Truth to be Told. They came here for an illicit trade in the pretense of a penal colony. They came here to take our land and resources for the better of empire, and we definitely have not ceded our rights to our country. Next is titled, Is Australia Ready for the Truth? Since taking office, the Albanese government has put First Nations affairs front and centre, whether that be from the appointment of the first Aboriginal woman as a minister, to the inclusion of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait flags at press conferences, to movement on the Voice. Labor has further promised to abolish the racist Community Development Program, the cashless debit card to increase funding for justice reinvestment projects and to enhance the participation of families in First Nations deaths in custody coronial inquiries. That's just writing in the sand, said Stanley, adding that the 10 Embassy had recently set up a body of representatives from the families involved in the Royal Commission into Aboriginal deaths in custody, and it's calling on the new PM and Indigenous Affairs Minister to meet with them. The Aboriginal 10 Embassy has been around for 50 years and it's held many governments to account over that time. Simpson Pitt concluded, the Aboriginal 10 Embassy intends to do the same for the Albanese government. We'll keep everyone accountable. So that's the end of that article. Please like, share, subscribe, all that good stuff, and I'll catch you guys on the next episode.
Try to play, but you're never gonna beat me. Look the other way, what I'm doing ain't easy. Bloody hands stained from the people who deceive me. Muddy hands break through the chains, go free me.